Well, I want you to imagine this morning with me a story. Just try to use your imagination and just think this through with me. A story about a dad who always wanted to have a little girl. He prayed over and over, and him and his wife, they prayed. They wanted to have a family, and they prayed that they would one day be able to have a little girl. And one day it happened, and this little girl was born. And if you're a dad, you know exactly that moment when you first saw your child born. And this girl became the sparkle in her daddy's eye. But that same day, there was a woman who was filled with pain. The man, he couldn't wait to get home from work every day because he knew that as soon as he walked through those doors, his little girl was going to scream, or squeal, I should say, "Daddy's home." She started growing up way too fast, but he still always called her his little girl. The woman, on the other hand, she was alone and scared. But the father, he loved playing with this little girl, making up games, and watching her become like her mom in so many ways. Her personality was contagious, and everybody loved seeing this little girl, loved watching her smile and giggle with delight. And he would throw her on his shoulder sometimes, and as painful as that was, your dads know what I'm talking about, but we still keep them up there, he made sure everyone saw his little girl. But for the woman, each day was filled with isolation, rejection, and fear. Now the little girl, she's 12 years old. She's already a teenager, becoming a young lady way too fast. But the love of her dad only keeps growing, just keeps growing. 12 years of just happiness and enjoying their time as a family. The woman, instead of happiness, she's had 12 years of sorrow. In the Gospel of Mark, we see a very unique chapter, Mark chapter 5. And what's so unique about this passage is that the writer tells us two opposite stories of two people with completely different backgrounds. Both individuals have one thing in common, though. They are in desperate need of Jesus. Jesus had just returned from Capernaum, and in Mark chapter 4, we see this story where he's in the boat sleeping in the middle of this crazy storm with his disciples, and he asked them the question, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And they were amazed that even the wind and the waves obeyed him. And then right after this, as they arrive on the shore, they get to the shore, and there's this man there who Jesus delivers of being demon-possessed. And Jesus gives this man identity and a mission and a purpose to reach people, to reach his own people for Jesus. Now, after that particular story, the crowds were eager for Jesus to leave. But the crowds on the other side, they were ready. They were expecting him. And two individuals in particular were about to have an encounter that would cause their faith to grow in an incredible way. And the contrast of these two individuals reveals the wideness of Christ's love and his mercy. In Mark chapter 5, beginning in verse 21, this is what it says. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. I want to take you today through 3 simple stages of belief that I think we find in this story. And the first one I'm going to talk about is uninformed belief. What a contrast between these two individuals. Jairus, an important synagogue leader. The woman was a nobody. She was anonymous. Jairus was probably wealthy. This lady had spent everything she had on remedies, doctors, trying to cure her illness, and she was bankrupt. In fact, in this source of Jewish religious law, it's called the Talmud, there were different remedies that were mentioned for people with this type of illness. And just to give you an example, They were very random. But one of the remedies was people would need to carry the ashes of an ostrich egg in a cloth. This is the type of stuff that she probably or maybe would have tried. And there's several of them mentioned in this text. Jairus, now though, was desperate, along with this woman. Both of these individuals are desperate. And he was about to lose his daughter, who was very important to him. And that's why we see he calls her his little daughter. Now, she's 12 years old. She's not, I think that's little. But, when I think about my daughter, she starts talking about boys. I'm like, yeah, you're not getting married till like 60, But you get the idea. So I get where Jairus is coming from. But one commentary puts it this way when it talks about the love of a parent. It says, parental love leaves a parent wide open to towering joys and to the deepest sorrow. Some of us have known what it is like to see a convulsing kid and wonder what if he was going to make it. We would do anything to save our child. So this is Jairus and his wife. They are at the very bottom. And Jairus had probably heard some of the miracles of Jesus. He had probably, his money couldn't do anything to solve this problem. And so he goes out to find Jesus. And this is an uninformed belief because he doesn't know for sure what is going to happen. He hasn't seen firsthand what Jesus can do. Maybe he's talked with somebody. Maybe somebody has told him about a miracle of someone experiencing a healing, but he doesn't know for sure. And with his position at the synagogue, being seen with Jesus was a step of faith for Jairus. So he takes a step of faith. When a person jumps out of a plane, I think it's a little crazy myself, but when they believe that parachute is going to open, but they still have to take that leap. I was going to say step, but it's really a leap. It's a leap of faith. In Mark chapter 5, verse 22, at the end of that verse, it says, when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live. This statement, it doesn't indicate that Jairus all of a sudden has this incredible belief in Jesus. In fact, it's an indication that this is his only chance. This is like a last resort. He's going to do whatever it takes. So he's going to fall at the feet of Jesus and plead with Jesus. In fact, he's going to kind of look like a fool. The woman also goes to find Jesus. She has this same type of belief. It's uninformed. She's desperate. She's tried everything. And she's as much of an outcast in society as the guy we met in Mark chapter 4, the demon-possessed man. She has no social life, no religious life. She's an outcast. In verse 27, it says, she had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I will be healed. She too didn't know what was going to happen in this situation. Her belief was uninformed. In fact, it might have been even a little superstitious if she had even tried some of those remedies before. But Jesus was her last option at that moment. And all throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus encourage people in their faith, in their time of need, at their lowest point. And he tells them to simply believe. And if you remember last week, I mentioned that we can pretty much believe in anything. We can believe in Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny, the weatherman. I'm supposed to get a laugh from you guys. Probably shouldn't have put those three in the same room, so I hope there's no weatherman here. But I'm sure you as parents have probably had that conversation. Are there any kids in this place? Okay, I don't want to ruin anybody's childhood for here, but I'll try to tread lightly. So, you have those conversations when you're trying to find out if a certain character is for real or not. We'll just leave it like that. We'll just in case. So, and I remember my daughter, she would ask those questions. And, you got to be so careful as a parent how you respond in those moments because you could totally destroy your child's worldview in one moment, just by saying the wrong answer. So she was asking, like, is so-and-so real? And, we had the conversation, and my wife was like, no, not real. And so, long story short, she goes to school, and she ends up telling her friend. Nobody thinks anything of it. My wife goes to pick my daughter up, and one of the parents sought my wife out along with her daughter and was like, hey, your daughter says that this particular character is not real. And anyway, she was trying to make my wife just tell her, yes, tell my daughter that this character is real. That was an awkward conversation. So then with my son, I tried to have this conversation like, hey, this character's not real. Don't go telling your friends that they're not real just to be safe. He comes home one day and he's like, Dad, all my friends are sad. And I'm like, what did you do? Like, what happened? It's like, and he's like, I basically just told him that, one of these characters, for lack of not saying their name, because I'm concerned now, because I'm a parent. But he was like, yeah, I told him that he wasn't real. I'm like, oh, son, no, you weren't supposed to say anything. But so all his friends were disappointed that this character was not for real. And in his case, it would probably be like Sonic, like if I said Sonic's not real, he would have had a total heartbreak. But now he's good. He's good. It doesn't matter what approach you take with your kids. Your kids are always going to be clever, okay? Just that's word of advice. But the concept of believing that Jesus mentioned over and over was the type of belief that, as I mentioned last week, endures through hardships, moves past negativity, and refuses to complain. The type of belief that Jesus talked about was the kind of belief that stays calm in the middle of the storm, doesn't fear, simply trusts, simply believes. So let's look at a few quick examples in the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 27 says, after Jesus left the girl's home, 2 blind men followed along behind him, shouting, Son of David, have mercy on us. They went right into the house where he was staying, and Jesus asked them, do you believe I can make you see? Yes, Lord, they told him, we do. Then he touched their eyes and said, because of your faith, it will happen. Another man brought his son to the disciples to cast an evil spirit out. And in the past, they were able to do this, but for some reason, in this particular occasion, they could not. So they went to Jesus. This guy went to Jesus. In Mark chapter 9, verse 20 says, so they brought the boy, but when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. How long has this been happening? Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into the water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can. What do you mean if I can? Jesus asked. Anything is possible if a person believes. The father instantly cried out, I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief. Now, may that be our prayer today. God, despite everything that is going on around me, help me overcome my unbelief. You may have an uninformed belief, but if it's real, if it's sincere, God can move, God will honor it. It's time to move from uninformed belief to amazed belief. I shared this concept a while back, but I want to refresh your memory on it. In several places, we see this idea of amazed belief. Matthew chapter 7, verse 28, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Amazed just means to be struck, to be amazed at what's going on right there in that moment. And some of the crowds had heard Jesus, and they were struck the opposite way. They chose not to believe, not to be amazed at what Jesus was doing. They saw some of the miracles, but they ignored it. They had no explanation for Jesus' wisdom, the way he shared things, his words, his miraculous powers. But whatever the explanation, they were not going to consider the truth. We need to move past our feelings and move towards amazed belief. So how do we get there? I think many ways we need more Christians to start calling out what God is actually doing in their lives. Stop keeping it a secret. Encourage your brothers and sisters in Christ by sharing your testimonies of how God is moving in your life, how he's moving in your family. We say things like, I don't want to be too spiritual. I don't want to come across as too spiritual. No, we need to let people know what is happening in our lives and what God is doing, and we share that in humility. Parents, we need to recognize when God is changing our families. Good things are happening in our families. We see positive change, and we need to recognize that. Young people, we need to recognize when God is helping you in a project at school or helping you in sports, whatever it might look like. It's about being a person that is living amazed all the time of what God is doing. In Mark chapter 11, we see another example. Verse 22, it says, Then Jesus said to his disciples, Have faith in God. I tell you the truth. You can say to this mountain, May you be lifted up and thrown into the sea, and it will happen. But you must really believe it will happen and have no doubt in your heart. I tell you, you can pray for anything, and if you believe that you've received it, it will be yours. But when you are praying, first forgive anyone you are holding a grudge against, so that your Father in heaven will forgive your sins too. In order to believe the impossible, we need to make sure things are right in our lives. Forgiving people, not holding grudges, not being bitter. When we are living in sin, we're not living amazed at what God is doing. We're living in guilt. And God starts to reveal himself to us and to others when we live in obedience to him and his word. Here's another example in John chapter 11. This is one of my favorite ones, the story of Lazarus. John chapter 11, verse 40 says, Jesus responded, "Didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe?" So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me, but I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so that they will believe you sent me." Then Jesus shouted, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth. Jesus told them, "Unwrap him and let him go." You will begin to see the glory of God in many situations. You will begin to be amazed at the glory of God in many situations, including the hard ones, if you simply believe. And I think there's a good lesson for all of us in the room, no matter what stage of life we're in. This contrast between Jairus and the woman, because not everybody has the same degree of faith. But Jesus responds to faith, no matter how feeble it might be. When we believe, he shares his power with us, and something happens in our lives. Something incredible happens, and what begins to happen is true belief. And that's the third point I want to talk to you about this morning. So let's go back to our original passage. We see the woman. She's making her way through the crowd, and she probably wasn't even supposed to be in that crowd because of the Levitical law and her illness. But she's making her way through the crowd, and she touches Jesus' robe. And in verse 29, it says, immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" I don't know if you've seen the show of The Chosen, but they portray this particular encounter. And when I heard that line from Jesus in this show, "Who touched my robe?" it was incredibly powerful to think about that moment. We know Jesus, he knew what was going on in that moment. But for him to say that question out loud, what an incredible moment. And we're going to talk about this here in a second, but in verse 31 it says, his disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask, 'Who touched me?'" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." As Jesus and Jairus are headed to his home, there's this interruption with this woman. The woman is healed after 12 years of agony, and she planned to just slip away. Hopefully she could just touch his robe. Something might happen, that uninformed belief. But Jesus wasn't going to have that. And he tenderly draws out of her a testimony of what God had just done in her life. He didn't want her to remain anonymous. He wanted to be more than just her healer. He wanted to be her savior and her friend. And she experienced something more than physical healing. He calls her daughter, which is actually only the second time that we see Jesus refer to a woman as daughter. Kent Hughes says this. In other words, he says Jesus was kind of saying this: "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Not your touch, not your superstition, not magic, but your faith." And all this is taking place, and can you imagine what's going on in Jairus' mind? Like, we got to get to my house. And he's just there. He's waiting. But this moment wasn't just for the woman. This moment was for Jairus to be able to grow his faith, because he was about to be tested already. And in Mark chapter 5, verse 35, it says, while he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the house of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. just have faith. The NIV says, don't be afraid, just believe. When Jairus heard this, it had to have been deflating just to think this was his last hope, his last chance. But Jesus, in this moment, was challenging his faith to come up higher and his premature belief to come up higher. Another commentary says, Jesus was saying this, you had a certain amount of faith when you came to me, and your faith was helped when you saw what I did for that woman. Don't quit. Keep on believing. You know, it was easier probably for him to trust Jesus when his daughter was alive. But now he receives these words that his daughter is dead. But Jesus encouraged him. And just like that, I believe Jesus does that for us. When we are discouraged, when we read the Bible, we receive a word of faith from God. Or maybe we're talking to someone that we trust and they give us an encouraging word. And I'm not talking about the type of encouragement that's like, hey, here's what you need to do. It's more of the encouragement of you're being led by the Spirit and you're having these conversations. Hey, here's a word of encouragement for you. Something I read today, something I read in the scriptures. I think we can say that Jairus, though was at a low moment, continued to believe despite hearing this news. And because they continued on, they kept on walking towards his home. And in verse 37, it says, then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep. The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave and took the little girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which means, little girl, get up. And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and then he told them to give her something to eat. We know that the little girl was dead because Mark tells us that the mourners were in the home. And they never would have called them to the house if there was even a chance that this little girl was alive. So here was another moment where Jairus is going to have to be tested in his faith. Imagine walking up to the house with Jesus and hearing the mourners. Just another, he knew his daughter was dead, but now he's hearing this, confirming his thoughts. But Jesus quiets the crowd and says, she's only sleeping. And so he goes to the little girl's room and he holds her hand. And probably that was wrong too with the Levitical law, but Jesus didn't care about that. And he grabs her hand and he says, Talitha cum, which means little girl, or sometimes it's translated as little lamb. I love this by Kent Hughes. He says, can you hear the word as it falls on the girl's cold, dull ears? Can you see her eyes flutter and open wide? The first thing she saw was the face of Jesus, and then the faces of her mother and father, and then 3 enraptured apostles. What an incredible moment for everyone present. We know the disciples would have a true belief because they would go on to need it in their future ministry. They were going to have some trials, but they would have this true belief. I think Jairus' family was completely transformed that day. I think this woman's life was completely transformed that day. There was no uninformed belief. They were amazed at what God did, but it turned to true belief because they had seen God work in their life. Let me finish by telling you one more story. There was a book called The Sacred Chase by Heath Adamson, and he tells a story about a little girl named Tilly Smith. You may have heard this. But it was December 26, 2014. Tilly Smith and her family were relaxing on a beach. They were on a vacation in Thailand. Pretty cool location to be. This is the first time they had ever been there. And 10-year-old Tilly, her parents, her 7-year-old sister Holly, they went for a walk along this particular beach in front of their hotel. And nothing negative was on their mind. They were walking on the beach, feeling the sand between their toes, the sun, picking up seashells. They were just enjoying their time as a family. But something interesting had happened a couple weeks prior. Tilly was in a geography class, and probably most of the time she didn't really pay attention too much. But a couple weeks prior, she saw a video that her teacher showed about tsunamis. And for some reason, this stuck in her mind and stuck in her head. So as Tilly and her family were walking along the beach, she noticed that the waves were coming in but not going out. And so she started to tell this to her parents, but they were a little dismissive at first. But she began shouting. Imagine this. You're on the beach on vacation, and your little girl starts shouting, "There's going to be a tsunami." I mean, that is enough to freak you out, especially if you're walking by people like, "Hey, be quiet. Just stop. There's not going to be a tsunami. We're okay." But she kept shouting louder and louder that there's going to be a tsunami. You imagine your 10-year-old daughter saying that. She shouted so loud that her sister started to panic, and she started crying uncontrollably. So the dad had to calm her down, and he took her to the hotel to try to calm her down. And they kept saying, "Everything's going to be fine, everything's going to be fine," but it wasn't working. And somehow, Tilly knew that something wasn't right. So she runs back to the hotel, and she hears her dad having a conversation with a security guard and he's like, "Look, my daughter thinks there's going to be a tsunami." You know, I can only imagine that conversation, but the security guard took it to heart. And he ended up trying to take he got the word out, and all the people from the beach, they all came in. What's interesting here is that there was a tsunami that day, and it was an incredible tragedy. It was several nations. A lot of people lost their lives. But no one on this particular beach, to my knowledge and to the knowledge of this source, suffered any death that day because of this little 10-year-old girl. And the thing that was interesting is the dad, after he was kind of struck with everything that had happened and what was going on, he asked his daughter, he's like, "What if we hadn't listened to you? What if we hadn't listened to you? Like, what if no one would have listened to Tilly?" And the author takes it a step further, and he's like, what if Tilly hadn't listened to herself? If God is speaking to you today, but you're fearful, that your faith is too weak, it's uninformed, you're having a hard time believing in yourself and what you know to be true, and what you know God says about you, that you're his child, take Jesus' words to heart. Don't fear, just believe. And I'm here to tell you that he knows every heart. Ask him to give you the faith you need to believe. God, help me with my unbelief, and he will. What you believe and who you believe is crucial. And just like this little girl, Tilly, when she took what she believed, she did something with it. She took a step of faith. I'm going to ask the worship team just to lead us in this course that we sang during worship. And I'm going to come back here in just a minute, and we're going to close this service. But I'm just going to challenge you to, as this song is playing, to make your way up to the altar. Because I know that a lot of us are believing for some things in our life. We're believing for God to move. We're believing for some healings. We're believing for, and we say it, but the challenge for us this morning is to simply just start believing that God's going to do it. If you need your faith to come up higher, come up here. And just allow God to speak to you during this song. If you're believing for some things in your life, believe God for them and just come up here. There's nothing valuable in coming up here except for the fact that it's just a step of faith. It's symbolic. You could do it in your seat, but coming up here is symbolic. Saying, God, I'm going to step up in front of the people that I know, in front of the people that I trust, and I'm going to believe. During this course, just allow God to simply speak to you and encourage you.